When you read these statements of utter destruction and wiping people off the face of the earth, maybe it's not actual literal history as much as it is a literary device to communicate a greater point. And it's up to us to seek out the wisdom of that, whatever there may be, in light of that. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Whiskey in the Writings. I'm your host, Joe. You know, a lot of people seem to have a point of view of God that he's some sort of a monster, at least the Old Testament God, a God that delights in the genocide and the death of humans and the abuse of creation. And I just wonder, maybe those stories aren't exactly what we think they are. And so today on Whiskey in the Writings, we're going to look at one of those stories in particular and actually explore whether or not we understand this text for what we think it is. All right, y'all, we're going to get right into it. And today, as we talk about our whiskey, I want to talk about this brand new Bardstown bourbon bottled and bombed that I found on the shelf. This is unopened. I've never tasted this before. I've never had it before. And you know me, when I see a bottled and bombed, I pick it up, or at least attempt to. And because it's one of my favorite kinds of bourbons that is out on the market. And if you don't know what bottled and bond is, it's simply a particular way in which bourbon is made. That has to go through a bunch of requirements for it to be called a bottled and bond, and it gets a certificate and that sort of stuff. So it's just a particular kind of way you can make bourbon that gets the bottled and bond labeled. And I just particularly like the flavor. I like the high alcohol percentage. In this one particularly, it's been aged for 6 years. So this is a 6-year bourbon. You've got 68% corn, 20% wheat. And there's some malted barley in there as well, 12%. So I'm going to expect a little bit of that smoothness of that malted barley. That's going to be a good flavor, I think. So all that to say, this is 100 proof, and we're going to open it up. I have never had this before, and I always get a little nervous when I'm opening up a bottle live on this channel because I don't know what the first impressions are going to be. In that, is it going to come off really strong? Is it going to need to breathe a little bit? Some whiskeys kind of need that moment to let it air out a little bit. You can speed up that process in different ways. You can even put an ice cube in it, kind of dilute that bite at the beginning. I prefer it, and so I'm excited to see what this is like. But we're gonna do our smell first because. Right out of the gate, I can kind of usually tell, oh, this is going to punch you, or it might be a little lighter. Let's see what the smells are. Okay, this right out of the gate doesn't hit you strong. Yeah, it's got a very caramely taste to it, which you would expect. It's lighter for a 6-year. I would expect it to be a little darker, but that's okay too. Set that right there. And I'm excited to try this bottled and bombed Bardstown. I don't know. I've never even seen it before. Where's it come out of? This is out of, where are these guys at? Kentucky. Yeah, they're right in Kentucky. So just right in the heart of bourbon making is Bardstown bourbon. And here we go. This is a first time taste test on Whiskey in the Writings. Let's see what it's like. There's the burn right there. Boy, that hit you. Okay, so in the bottle I didn't get that burn, but when it opened up in the glass, whoo, this one might sting a little bit. Let's see. Okay. Holy cow, that is really smooth. That initial smell that I got didn't hit the tongue like I thought it would. Okay, there it comes a little bit in coming back. sitting on the tongue. It's a little tingly there. The first impression going down, super smooth. I didn't get the bite that I expected to get, which was a nice surprise. As it sits a little bit and finishes, yep, you can definitely taste it. The flavors are good. There's a bit of smokiness, I think, in it. I wonder if that's from the barley. Obviously, the char and the barrel. That's a good whiskey. That's a good little sipper. I like that. Okay. Well, whatever you have in front of you, pour your bourbon, your whiskey, your water, whatever you got, and let's begin. Cheers. Okay. Put a lid on that. All right. We got a hot topic today. I'm excited to dive into this with you. This is one of those that, just to be honest, I hear this as being a pain point for a lot of people in their willingness to trust or believe or have faith in God. And the idea is, the Old Testament seems to be a power-hungry, genocidal maniac that's on the loose in creation. And these stories that you read about can be pretty terrible. And I'm not one to gloss over this in the sense of like, oh, it wasn't that bad or whatever. I do think there are things worth discussing. And so if you've been someone that has really wrestled with the idea of the violence of the Old Testament and what God seems to condone and or even initiate, this might be a good episode for you to ponder and sit with. Now, I'll be upfront with you. I'm not saying I'm going to cover every single aspect. We're not even going to get into the Joshua conquest, which is a whole other part of this conversation that needs to be investigated. And there have been a lot of apologists that have done probably a better job than I will. And I'm not trying to be an apologist here. I just want to engage in a conversation. And the reason why I'm picking this out is because I was doing some reading the other day and I came across this text that we're going to explore. And it just really stood out to me for a number of reasons. And I thought it'd be worth exploring with you because the idea here is that maybe this doesn't mean what you think it means. And I want to maybe open up and expose that a story like this, when understood through a different lens, takes on a whole new meaning. And if we can come to a place where we can explore and understand this, maybe other difficult parts that we struggle with can take on new light and new meaning as well. And so that's what we're doing here. Did God actually command? Did he approve? Did he sanction genocide? Is God a monster? And to look at that, we're going to explore Exodus chapter 17. So you can go ahead and pull out your Bibles. And just to give you an idea of where some of the framework of kind of my background in reading and studying, a primary book for this, if you want to explore further some of these ideas, not particularly or simply the idea is God a monster type stuff, but just to really go through these Old Testament stories through a new lens. The Pentateuch as Narrative by Selheimer is a wonderful book for you to use as a companion reading for the Old Testament. Basically, it goes through the Pentateuch, and you can take these stories. Maybe you're reading a story in Leviticus and you're struggling to understand the significance of it. This is a great companion guide to your reading. So I encourage this as something you should have on your library, the Pentateuch as narrative, and that has been extremely helpful in the conversation we're having today. So I'm just going to set that aside. I just wanted to share that with you for your reading and extra learning. So we're going to look at a story in the writing called Exodus in the Pentateuch, and particularly, we're gonna look at a story in Exodus chapter 17. And so I want to read the story to you. I'm going to go back and I'm going to pull out some nuggets of thoughts and ideas, and then we're gonna approach the topic at hand, and you'll see it at the end here what I'm talking about, and we're going to explore that maybe and see what's actually happening in the story versus what we read. So the story goes like this: at this point in time, Moses had led the people out of Egypt, so they are wandering. They're close to Canaan, the promised land that they were promised, and they come up against an adversary. And so it says this in verse 8 of Exodus chapter 17: Amalek came and attacked Israel in Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua fought against Amalek just as Moses had instructed him. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses would raise his hands, the Israel prevailed. But whenever he would rest his hands, then Amalek prevailed. When the hands of Moses became heavy, they took a stone and put it under him. And Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and one on the other. And so the hands were steady until the sun went down. So Joshua destroyed Amalek and his army with the sword. The Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in the book, and rehearse it in Joshua's hearing. For I will surely wipe the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." Moses built an altar, and he called it, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, "For a hand was lifted up to the throne of God, that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Okay, so that's the story. It's a pretty popular story in church circles. I remember hearing this is early on in my remembering this early on in my readings is a young man become first time Christian. I remember this being taught in sermons, and oftentimes this is talked about it through the lens of like this idea of worship, of lifting the hands and winning the battle. And there's all of these kind of like tropes and ideas of trying to make it relevant to us today in a sermon, like, see how Moses lifted his hands to God, and you lift your hands to God and you'll get the victory. So those are ways that pastors use this in messages, and I'm not saying that's bad. There's actually this Aramaic text that retells this story, and it adds the layer that when Moses lifted his hands in prayer, and so it gives this kind of undercurrent that the action of lifting the hands is prayer. And so there is like this rabbinic tradition of this idea of like this was a prayerful act that Moses is doing, an act of worship, and that's what gave him the victory. And so there's some of those connections that I can see how people make that. But on the surface, it's a very interesting story. And so I want to spend a minute talking a little bit about some of the details in this story, and then really hone in on verse 15 and 16, 14, 15, and 16, as the crux of this idea of God wiping out people, blotting them out, utterly destroying them. So we're going to look at that towards the end, but there's a few observations I want to make early on. So this is an interesting story because a few things happen in this story for the first time. One of the first time things that happens in the story is that we're introduced to Joshua. Joshua is the guy that is kind of the right-hand warrior for Moses. Joshua is the guy that takes over when Moses dies and leads the Israelites into the land of Canaan. He is the one who leads all the conquests that you get in the writing called Joshua. The book of Joshua. So you get all those stories. It's him. It's that guy. And this is the first time in the text that his name is mentioned. And he's mentioned as a warrior that goes out and listens to the instructions of Moses and goes out and prepares for battle, gathers people together. So he's a leader. He's introduced as a warrior. And that tracks exactly as you're entering into Joshua. You would expect that because of a story like this. So that's an interesting aspect of first in this. Another first that you get in this story is verse 14. And I just want to pause there for a second, because in verse 14, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in the book." So other translations render this differently, but they're all basically the same. Write this down. Remember this. This is the first time in the biblical text, as we have it, from Genesis to Exodus 17, that anywhere it's talked about writing it down. So I love Tim Mackey. He brings this out in a lecture that he does called Who Wrote the Bible, or Writing the Bible. You can find it on YouTube. It's a brilliant lecture. And he makes the observation that this is the first time that the Bible talks about the Bible being written. Like, think about that for a second. The first time in the Bible that the Bible's being written. This story is being written down to be remembered. Now, why is that important? Okay, so there's this concept called the documentary hypothesis, and it was actually started by a guy named Wellhausen back in the 1800s, late 1800s. He developed this hypothesis called the documentary hypothesis that proposed that there were different people that all played a role in writing down different parts of the Pentateuch. And he identifies them as a JEDP framework, which means J is Yahwehists, E is Elohists, Elohim, Elohists, D is the Deuteronomists, and P is the priests. And so each one of those characters play a different role at different periods of time in history that compiled and wrote these things. Now, more modern scholarship has taken more of have taken what's called the documentary hypothesis, and it's evolved into, like, not a lot of scholarship holds to the JEDP model anymore. Most hold to what's called a fragmentary hypothesis, which is to say that whoever composed these writings that we call the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, whoever compiled these things and brought them to what we have in our Bibles used fragments or stories that were preserved. So you would imagine like an editor sitting down and has all these different stories and fragments around, and he's like, "Oh, I like that one. Oh, I like that one." And he weaves them together to make what we call these writings. And so this idea of write this down is very interesting, because it's talking about preserving a story of a war or a battle that could have been used, like someone, in the, the 5th or the 4th century, maybe even the 3rd century, had that writing, and they brought it in as they were compiling the story of Exodus. They were using narrative that had been handed down in written form and from prior generations, preserved from prior generations. I think that's a fascinating thought. And I bring that out just to say that how interesting is it that within the text of the Bible, you have it being talked about, being written, and someone had that story, and of Joshua going out to battle against Amalek, and Moses having to lift his hands and then propping his arms up. Aaron and Hur are there to prop up his hands. I mean, I think it's a really cool thought process of the Bible being written at the time that events took place. And who's to say that other scenarios in these texts weren't the same thing, that someone decided, "Oh, that was really good, I'm going to write that down." It was preserved. Someone had that fragment, piece of clay, tablet, or whatever, and decided to incorporate that into the corpus that we call the Pentateuch, to frame it in such a way to leave us with what we have now. And before you say, "Well, Joe, doesn't that take away from like the inspiredness or the God wrote it?" Actually, I think it enhances that. I think one can be inspired to preserve a story, even though that story wasn't written by God, right? This idea that God, they just wrote down these words in some kind of like mystical, like kind of like way, but these are real stories by real people preserving an idea of an event that took place and maybe shaping that, maybe reframing that. Was it coincidence that every time God lifted his hand, Joshua got a boost of energy and was like just doing battle? Was it God's divine intervention? Right? Those are discussions that you can have. The point is that it was preserved. Like this was written down to remember. And it goes on to say and to rehearse it in Joshua's hearing. This idea that Joshua, as the leader of the Israelites, would have spent time listening to this story over and over and over again. What did that do to frame Joshua's mentality when you get the events that take place in the writing Joshua? I don't know. It's just very fascinating to think about. So there are a couple firsts here. The first is the first time you hear about Joshua, and another first is the first time you see the writing of the Bible taking place in the Bible. So that's really interesting. So let's talk real quick. Who are the Amalekites? Who's Amalek? Who are the Amalekites? To kind of help you see this in a couple different ways. So first off, know that the only known reference to a people group living in Canaan, or anywhere for that matter, the only reference to this people group exists in the Bible. Okay, this isn't like the Hittites. This isn't like other groups that are listed in the Bible. This is unique in that nowhere else are these people, there's no historical record of these people that we have, as far as I could tell in my research. Maybe there's something out there that I missed, but anywhere in my research, there's no archaeological evidence of the Amalekites existing outside of the Bible. So that's interesting. And where does the Bible say they came from? According to the biblical text, at least in places like Numbers 13, they are people that lived in southern Canaan. So if you're thinking of the Levant in what we now call Palestine, Jerusalem, this area, they're in the southern part of that Canaan, and they're nomads. They are known to be people who move around. They don't really have a home place that they exist from. So they're nomads from the land of Canaan, and Amalek is a king of these people, at least at the point of this story. And Amalek is the grandson of Esau. If you're tracing the genealogy record back, we learn that Amalek is the grandson of Esau. Who is Esau? Well, it's the brother of Jacob. And so there's a lot of thought behind this thematically. And I think this is an important thing that you're going to see here in a second that I'm going to draw out about this story. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was formed and written over time. There was never one particular moment that all of a sudden it was just all written and composed, or someone sat down and went, you know what, I'm going to tell the story of our people. The Hebrew Bible was formed, edited, adapted, both in the time that it was written and after. So a good example of this is if you were to take the Amos prophet, he's one of the 12 prophets, minor prophets, and if you were to take that scroll, one thing that scholars have noticed is that, let's take Zechariah for a second, because I know that one more. I know that one better. The Zechariah scroll, the beginning of Zechariah, the beginning chapters of the scroll Zechariah, it has narrative that is different than the back end of the scroll, meaning that the events and things that are talked about at the back end of the chapters of Zechariah are different than the beginning. And so what the hypothesis is that there was a historical Zechariah who prophesied at a particular time in Israel's history. And then much later, so this is the time of pre and maybe mid-exile. And then you have the back end where another person continued on in the scroll, added content to the scroll that represents a post-exilic, even a Ptolemaic empire, which is the Greek empire that came after the Persians. After Alexander died off, his kingdom got divided up and the Ptolemies took over like the southern Levant and Egypt. And so the back end of Zechariah is commentary on that kingdom, where the front end of that writing is focused on like Assyria, Babylon. So two different timetables, two different people. There was a writing and then it was added to. And if that causes like, if you go and like, oh, I don't like that because did God write it? Right? We have this like Protestant point of view that sometimes when you get to the actual data and the facts, it's difficult to reconcile. Here's what I would say. I would say to that is just simply that one, the Hebrew Bible is not our text. It is a Jewish piece of literature, and they get to do with their literature what they want to do with it. And so, and that can still be inspired. It can be inspired that someone came in and added content at the end of Zechariah's scroll to reflect through the same vein as the earlier parts of Zechariah to have commentary on their day and age. That's okay. Okay, that was a big rabbit hole. I say all of that to say that when we think of these stories, one, the question isn't simply, is it true? Okay. That sometimes we read the story like, well, did that really happen? That's not entirely the best question to ask. Is this true? A better question to ask is, why am I being told this story? Okay. So out of all the stories that could be told, why this one? And I think that's a better story, because what you see in this story is that the Amalekites represent the first people group to oppose Israel as they come out of Egypt. And the very people that are doing that is the Amalekites, the king Amalek. And if Amalek is the descendant of Esau, who are the Israelites a descendant of? Jacob, right? If we're following the narrative flow, okay? And the narrator, the one who's compiling these stories, seemed to want us to cue into a conflict that started long ago between two brothers. You see what I'm saying? So there's a context here that already tips us off that maybe there's a thematic undertone to this story that may play a part later on in the narrative. Right? So already we have, why are the Amalekites coming and attacking Israel? Verse 8 gives us no context for it. It just says they came and attacked. And if we understand that Amalek is a descendant of Esau, there might be this tension that's being brought up again to go, remember in Genesis, who else was there conflict between? Jacob and Esau. Now there's conflict again with Jacob's descendants and Esau's descendants. So there's thematic literature that's being shared, and we should be tuning into that versus like, did it literally happen this way? We should go, oh, there's something more going on here. Okay. All that to say, that's some of that stuff that's going on. Now, let's get to a really challenging verse here. Let's get to the heart of what we're talking about, because I've been setting all this up for far too long. We do have a point. Okay, so in verse 14, it says, the Lord said to Moses, write as a memorial in the book and rehearse it in Joshua's hearing. For, this is what God's saying. Okay, this is where we bristle, right? I will wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, which is to say on the earth. God says, write this down, because I'm going to take him out. In fact, I'm going to do it so severely, no one will ever remember him. That's strong language, isn't it? This is where we get to this like, wait, God? Why? Because they attacked? Like where's the turn the other cheek? Where's the bless your enemy? Where's the pray for those who persecute? Where's the Jesus in that? Right? That's what we want to do. We want to pit the Old Testament God against the New Testament Jesus and say there's a discrepancy here. And guess what? If you've done that, and if you feel that pain, can I just argue, you're not the first to do that. Marcion in the late 1st century, 2nd century, that was his whole frustration. Like the whole concept of Arianism is this idea that the Old Testament God is a vindictive, evil God, and Jesus is the good God, and we should reject the Old Testament in light of that, in light of Jesus. And that got rejected very early on in Christian thought. They just went, no, that's not the case. And so I understand the urge to do that. And I understand that when you read something like, I will surely wipe them out. Some of your translations, if you're reading a different translation, might say utterly destroy. And there's tension in that. And we want to go, ew, that's gross. And the God that's about love wouldn't do that. Okay. So that is a perspective. And I want to offer that maybe, just maybe, there's a different perspective. And what's interesting is that the text itself seems to offer the answer to the problem that we have. Because if we read just verse 14, we go, ew. But we can't stop there because there's a verse 15 and 16. And it says this. Right after, I'm going to blot them out. I'm going to erase their names. They won't be remembered. It says in verse 15, Moses built an altar and he called it, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, verse 16, for a hand was lifted up to the throne of God, right? This idea of praise or prayer. That the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Okay, so which one is true? Is God going to wipe them out, utterly wipe them out, like utter destruction, like completely erase the remembrance of them? No one will know who they are? Or will they be at war for generation to generation? Right? So inherently there's a tension in this text. Which one is it, God? And so we got to ask that question. Now, what's interesting, if you were to continue on in the biblical narrative, the Amalekites survive. All right. So there's the story in 1 Samuel 15. So this is at the histories aspect of the Hebrew Bible. You have Kings, you have Samuel. These are the histories. And in 1 Samuel 15, we read about the beginning of the downfall of King Saul. King Saul is the first king over Israel. And God tells Samuel to wipe out everyone of the king Agag or King Agag. And he's supposed to wipe them all out. And Saul begins to do that. He wages war against the Amalekites and he keeps the king Agag. And this displeases God because Saul didn't follow what God wanted him to do. And so this displeases, and this begins the downfall of God choosing David versus Saul, and it's a whole drama. Okay, but note, who's on the scene? The Amalekites, right? So clearly they're not utterly destroyed, right? In 1 Chronicles chapter 4:43, much later, you have again the Amalekites are defeated. A remnant of these Amalekites are defeated, and so there they are again appearing on the scene. So you have Exodus wipe them out. You have Samuel wipe them out. You have Chronicles trying to wipe them out. Like, there's this constant battle against these people group that keeps showing up in the text. And there's even one more interesting place that is questionable whether it's true or not. But the Amalekites, or at least a remnant of the Amalekites, still might be on the scene in the book Esther. In Esther, you have the antagonist Haman, And he is called an Agagite. And that is in reference and correlation to Agag in 1 Samuel 15, who is a king over the Amalekites from back in Exodus chapter 17. So already in Esther, like towards the end of the writings of the Hebrew Bible, you have them potentially appearing again. Now, some scholars think that this is just a narrative, like that is to get you to, again, think narratively, not historically. In that, if Haman is a part of the Agagites, then who are the protagonists and where are they from? And they're from the tribe of Benjamin. And so it talks about this conflict that has existed ever since Exodus 17. So what seems to be true here? Well, verse 16, the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation, seems to be more true than God saying, I will wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven after this battle. So that makes us go back to the text of wiping people out, utter destruction, and ask the question, what is happening here? What is happening here? I would argue that what if total destruction language, listen to me here, what if total destruction language in the Old Testament is a type of literary genre, not a moral problem that we need to solve? Let me say that again. What if all that total destruction language that God's, I'm going to wipe them out, I'm going to destroy them all, is merely a literary genre of destruction language that isn't about a moral problem that we've got to try to reconcile with God? What if there's more going on in the story? Now, what's interesting is that there are different steles and tablets that are from the pharaohs and other kings of other regions that use the same type of destruction genre language to communicate whatever truth or narrative truth that they're trying to support. So for instance, the most popular Egyptian stele that was discovered, it comes from a pharaoh, and it actually references the earliest name of Israel anywhere in archaeological evidence. And it's this old stele that a pharaoh wrote. And what does it say about Israel? It says that the pharaoh waged war against Israel and utterly destroyed them, wiping them off the face of the earth. Okay? Now, did that literally happen? No, because they're still around. What was happening was that it's a way of like propaganda, like war propaganda. I'm going to utterly destroy them. I'm going to take them all out. And yet they appear over and over again. So I want to offer this as a perspective, that when you read these statements of utter destruction and wiping people off the face of the earth, maybe it's not actual literal history as much as it is a genre of a literary device to communicate a greater point. And it's up to us to seek out the wisdom of that, whatever there may be, in light of that. And I would end with this. Once you start seeing the pattern of destruction genre and what it might mean or not mean, you begin to see it everywhere. One other point is in the Joshua conquest. You have the story of the people of Jericho being utterly wiped out, utterly destroyed. Not a man, male, female, not child, not animal is left alive. And you go, what is going on? How is that possible? And the reality is that later on in that same literature, those people still exist. So again, we have to ask the question, is this literal history or is it a genre that's being deployed in this case to communicate something else? And so is God really a monster? Is he commanding genocide and approving of it? Well, on a surface level reading, it appears the answer is yes. However, if you remember that these texts were written through a certain lens for a certain reason in a certain context with certain literary devices like destruction genre, maybe there's something more going on than simply an evil God trying to kill everybody. All right, folks, that's all I have for you on this conversation. Hopefully, it opens up a door of conversation for you, a door of thought for you to explore more in other places in the Hebrew Bible, areas that are concerning and difficult to read. Maybe there's more going on than meets the eye. That being said, thank you for watching for another episode of Whiskey in the Writings. I encourage you to, if it's your jam, to like, subscribe, share it with someone that might benefit from it, get the word out. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.